Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman, staff writer with The New Yorker Susan Glasser, and New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker. Peter, I'm going to start with you on this. It feels like something's changing today.
Yeah, you're seeing the drip, drip, drip beginning again. The president had kind of put a halt to this for about 24 or 48 hours with his letter and his call into Morning Joe on Monday and the NATO summit, which you rightly quote Nancy Pelosi talking about. She wanted any discussion of this to kind of hold off until after he was off the world stage. They don't want to embarrass the president when he's hosting leaders from around the world, but it hasn't stopped the drip, drip, drip. And you're hearing more and more from Democrats that they do not consider this to be a tenable situation going forward. Now, we'll see. He's going to give a press conference today at 6:30. Maybe he'll convince people to hold fast, to rally behind him. But obviously, there's a great deal of risk there because if he doesn't have a good news conference, it could accelerate the momentum the other direction.
Talk to me through the New York Times reporting regarding both these insiders. The White House, by the way, is flatly denying this, trying to come up with a plan to talk to Biden, but also this new news that they're polling Kamala Harris, Peter.
Yeah, look, part of the question for the president is, can he win? That's one question. The second question is, can somebody else win? This is the way that they're looking at framing this discussion with him, which they haven't had yet as far as we're told. Well, one way to tell whether or not somebody else could win is to decide whether or not Kamala Harris polls well. Now, this could play the other direction as well. It could be used to feed his desire to stay in by showing him polling results suggesting that Kamala Harris wouldn't do so well. So it kind of depends on which side of that internal debate you might be on. But that is obviously part of the conversation that's happening right now, at least among the people around the president, even if not necessarily with him.
All right, Monica, walk us through what NBC News has on all of this and where Biden stands.
I think Peter makes a really good point there, Katie. This could really be seen as a larger data point. The fact that the Biden campaign is quietly testing how Vice President Harris would do against Donald Trump is a piece of information that's a part of a larger conversation that the president might be having in the weeks ahead about a potential path forward, and that he may want to know how he does in current polling and how that stacks up to how she may do and whether she would fare better, worse, or roughly the same as. I think that's something that some people clearly feel is an important number to have and some key information. And we know there are other polls out there that have tried to assess this as well, but the Biden team clearly wants their own internal evaluation and assessment. So that is going to be taking place this week. But I'm told specifically that it was also done in the context of responding to what we saw from Donald Trump in the last couple of days, which is to really turn the dial up on the vice president specifically and to start to attack her a little bit more. So they also want to see how that may play with certain key voters in certain key states, and that is kind of part of this conversation as well, Katie. But I think it is just notable that this is happening while we're having these really serious conversations and while the president just in a few hours is going to be facing some really intense questioning about whether he really is still convinced that he should be the one to be the Democratic nominee. And then it raises this hypothetical that the president always likes to say, I don't want to answer things that are hypothetical. But in this case, it's really relevant, which is if he decides to step aside, if he does make that decision, will he completely hand over the reins to Vice President Harris, and would she become the nominee? And that conversation, of course, is something that's the key backdrop to a lot of this as they're still contemplating his path forward here.
We'll see if he actually answers that question or if he does decide to sidestep it. Answering it and saying that it would be Harris would be major. All right, Jake Sherman, on Capitol Hill, yesterday we saw Nancy Pelosi say he needs to make up his mind. That blew the door open. She knew that he'd already made up his mind, but for her to say that felt like her saying, hey, I'm going to open the door, and at some point you guys can walk through it if you need to her House colleagues. Today, yet another lawmaker, a couple more lawmakers, Peter Welch on the Senate side, but also, as we just mentioned at the top of the show, Brad Schneider, who just released his statement 6 minutes ago, saying that he thinks Biden should step aside. What are you hearing internally, and do you suspect or anticipate more lawmakers to come out publicly?
I do. That's what we've been told, Katie. Let me put it to you this way. It's difficult for me to imagine the administration, handling this matter worse on Capitol Hill. I mean, it might be possible, but I can't foresee, I can't understand what that would look like, because it's incredibly bad. The bleeding has not stopped up here, not even close. And Nancy Pelosi, Katie, said today, I asked her if she was concerned that all these people were coming out, and her response was, I just wish they would have done it after NATO. So it's not even that she's concerned that there are a dozen, and I know for a fact there's going to be more coming out in the next couple days. It's the fact that they did it during NATO, as Peter said, when all these world leaders are in town. Now, just about an hour ago, a meeting between several Biden administration officials, Mike Donilon, Steve Ricchetti, and Jen O'Malley Dillon, they met with Senate Democrats just an hour ago at the DSCC, the campaign committee, and it was, for those who are still on Biden's team, it was fine. For those who are on the fence or who have already said that Biden should leave or something similar to that, the meeting was a disaster, according to people who were there. They did not show any polling, Katie, not one scintilla of public polling or private polling that indicates that Biden should remain the nominee for president. It was basically, according to people we spoke to who were in the meeting, it was effectively a campaign presentation that you should stick with the president, we could win, there's still a path, etc. Senators are relatively wise people when it comes to campaigns. They all have to win their own. They felt like it was useless. Now, I don't know. I don't know what impact this all has, but I could just tell you, we're going to get to a point in the next week where there could be dozens, if not more than that, of Democrats who are out against Biden, who don't think he's up to the task. And tonight is just a major pivotal point for all these elected Democrats.
Susan, this moment is, as Jake said, pivotal. It also feels really risky. The Democrats haven't done something like this since, what was it, 68? They haven't gone to a convention to pick a new candidate. I mean, that's if they, don't have Joe Biden just passing it off to Kamala Harris, if it comes to that. What are the risks of Joe Biden deciding to step away?
Yeah, I mean, every day this goes forward, of course, is a bad day for the Democratic Party in the sense that the attention is all on their internal struggles without resolution. The focus is not on Donald Trump. It's not on the challenges on the world stage. Remember, this NATO summit is the 75th anniversary of NATO. I can't think of a more clear-cut contrast between Joe Biden's record and Donald Trump's record than the contrast between their two attitudes towards support for our allies in Europe and support for Ukraine after the Russian invasion. Biden has made this a signature of his foreign policy. He has spent the last few days meeting with fellow world leaders, seeking to essentially institutionalize Western support for Ukraine. Some people say to Trump-proof Western support for Ukraine, which is hard to do. At the same time that Donald Trump in a campaign rally is out there talking about basically questioning NATO's premise, saying, I didn't even know very much about it when I was president, and telling an apocryphal, almost certainly untrue story about how he would refuse to defend Western allies if they didn't, quote, pay up enough to NATO to satisfy him. So this is a contrast that they're not talking about. The political situation for Democrats has gone south every day that Biden's fate as a candidate has been uncertain. You've seen the poll numbers start to sink, even in states that we did not consider to be battleground states before this. And so I think that, at a certain point, there's kind of a game of chicken here between Biden and the Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill, who might be the only ones who would be able to confront him and to beg him to get out of the race directly. That hasn't happened yet. So we're in such uncharted territory, Katie, really. In 1968, that was in March. And now we are months past that, months past when LBJ left the race.
And also the convention was set up to nominate people. They understood how to do it. It was muscle memory. Doing it now would be a whole new thing for the delegates who are involved in trying to elect and choose a new candidate. You're talking about battleground states or new battleground states that seemed safe. New Hampshire is one of those states that's really up in the air right now. Susan, in regards to the fate of Joe Biden, the conversation that we're having, it doesn't seem like this conversation will go away if President Biden decides not to step aside. If he says I'm running and everybody gets behind him, there still is going to be this watch and see if he slips up again feeling among Americans. We're as George Clooney put it in his op-ed, where people hold their breath when he walks up to the podium to see if he has an unscripted answer that doesn't make sense, if he, says he spoke to the leader of a foreign country who has been long dead, that sort of thing. How does the Biden team recover when that narrative, or when that conversation, or that expectation, anticipation, fear, if you will remain out there?
Yeah, Katie, I think this is a very important point to make, because they can never fully put it to rest. And, every time Biden appears in public, there's the chance of resurrecting it. In effect, this has become a chronic condition of his campaign to manage, even assuming that he overcomes the worst of this political crisis moment. And so, you could see Democrats fall back in line, him get nominated by the convention, and then imagine this cropping up later in the campaign, even very late in the campaign in September or October. There is a second debate that was scheduled that's supposed to take place in September. What happens then? It would be much harder for Democrats to extricate themselves from a Biden candidacy after the point at which he is the official nominee of the party, rather than before, which is perhaps one of the unintended and, very much not necessarily welcome side consequences of having that historically early debate before the convention. So, we could be in a cycle where this reoccurs every moment up until the voting in November.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn. MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.